Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Well, hi, Fahrusha. Here we are again.
Here we are, and
you're going to slate us today. I
yes,
take it,
yes. Today is April 25th, 2017, and this is our 50th?
I don't
broadcast?
know.
I don't know if it's the 49th or 50th.
They start to blend.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, this is not going to blend because
Okay.
this is a fabulous guest that we have here today.
Yeah, we're very fortunate to have with us today Leslie Kean. She is an author who has set, in my opinion, and certainly lots of other people's opinion, a very high bar for investigative journalism. Her ability to do this was demonstrated by her last book, UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. For anybody who is newly interested in UFOs, this really should be your go-to book.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But today, our discussion is going to concern her new book, Surviving Death. And I would say death is probably the one thing that all humans have in common. To most of us, our passing leaves no apparent trace behind. However, Leslie Kean has investigated instances where this may not be the case. And that is the theme of this extraordinary compendium of evidence for an afterlife. So welcome to our show, Miss Leslie Kean.
Oh, it's great to be with both of you. Thanks for having me.
Okay.
It's our pleasure entirely. And for my part, I have to say that this is really a real, I guess the word is magnum opus. Is that a good word?
Yes, that would be an excellent description.
It's really, it's really very complete in its scope. I like the way you went from very simple things to more exotic things to like really exotic things at the end.
Yeah.
Physical mediumship is about as exotic as it gets. You really did a wonderful job, and thank you for doing it. We do have questions for you, and a lot of people who found out that we were having you on showed a great deal of interest in the idea of hearing you speak on this subject after having done such a fabulous job with the UFOs, because it is really one of maybe two or three go-to books that I own on UFOs. I put it out there with Colonel John B. Alexander's book and the historical books of Richard Dolan, insofar as those books, he's got thousands of cases of people having sightings. If just two or three of them are real, and I'm going to use your expression, the white crow idea, well, then it's a done deal, isn't it?
It doesn't. It only takes a little bit of evidence that if it's right on to make the point. That's right.
So you begin your study with instances of children with past life memories. This, I think, is, I don't know about you, Fahrusha, but this is the thing that most of the people I spoke to about your book were most interested in. And although I have heard of this from time to time. To be honest, it was never really a major source of interest to me, but some of the instances that you mentioned are just unbelievable, especially that one little fella, James Leininger.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was, if you could just tell the audience a little bit about that, I'm sure they'd be fascinated in hearing.
Absolutely, and I agree with you. These cases are extremely interesting and highly evidential, partly because the children involved are so young.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of James Leininger that you mentioned, he was only 2 years old, and literally from the time he was beginning to talk, he was talking about these memories he had. Not only were they memories of the past life, but he had a lot of knowledge about airplanes,
Right.
And he was obsessed with them. And this was knowledge that he couldn't possibly have learned anywhere from anybody. And there were lots of things he told his parents. I mean, I'll have to give you a very thumbnail sketch because we don't have a lot of time, but he ended up describing the specific type of aircraft that he flew, giving the name of it, the name of his best friend in this previous life. He described being shot in the front of his airplane by what he said was by the Japanese. And he just said the name of the aircraft carrier that he flew from, which was the Natoma. And he also, another interesting thing was he had very, very intensive nightmares for quite a period of time in which he relived the experience of this plane crash and was absolutely terrified. And eventually, but he started to have the nightmares before he could even talk. And once he could talk, he started to describe what was going on. He would wake up screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And when his parents asked him who was the little man, he would say, "James." They just thought he was talking about himself. And so anyway, lots of events happened over time. He revealed more and more very, very specific information. He pointed to the location of the crash in a book when he was looking at a book with his dad. And he also made a lot of drawings in which he drew the aircraft being shot down and signed them all James 3. His parents didn't know what the 3 meant. And eventually, after a lot of work with going to veterans meeting and trying to follow up on what his child was telling him, James's dad, Bruce, was able to find who this person was, that there was a person, and his name was actually James Houston Jr. And what was fascinating about that was that the junior meant that little James was James 3.
Right.
And when he had drawn all those pictures, his parents would say, "Why are you signing him James 3?" And he'd say, "I'm the 3rd James." So his dad was absolutely stunned. When he went to a veterans meeting, he tracked down Jack Larson, who was the name of the friend that little James had given him, and found out that James Houston Jr. was a pilot who was killed in 1945 in World War II and matched all the information that little James had provided, matched this particular person. James actually, then they ended up meeting the family, the sister of James Houston Jr., who at the time was in her 80s, and little James told her all kinds of information about his childhood growing up in the family, things that he couldn't possibly have known. And so what's really important about this case is that the fact that the information he provided was so specific, and then it could be verified as accurate. Because if somebody tells you they have a past life memory, and you can't verify any of it, you have no way of knowing whether the memory means anything or not. Right. But in this case, everything was on the record before they located James Houston, and all the information that he provided matched this person. And so that's very significant.
And really, what other explanation can there be?
I find it hard to come up with one. I mean, the only competing explanation might be that there was some kind of psychic perception that James Leininger had that for some reason plugged into the life of this person who lived, who died 50 years before he was born. I mean, it seems a harder explanation for me to accept. But if somebody doesn't want to accept the possibility of the survival of consciousness, they might argue that it was some bizarre psychic ability that he had. Or, of course, somebody could argue that it was hoxed, but I happen to have, the scientists who have, no, it's been ruled out. I mean, psychiatrist Jim Tucker, who's an expert in these cases, has ruled that out. It's just not possible. Right. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons why, but it isn't possible.
No, I don't think that we, in the focus of this show, need to talk too much about the idea of a hoax. I don't even want to kind of go there with this
necessary.
show. I think that it really isn't. But I will point out one thing about these past lives of young children, which I think the children are reporting what they feel, what they think. But even to my knowledge, Jim Tucker offers one other variant on the explanation, and I'm not saying it's true or false. I don't know what's true or false, but the other variant that he had pointed out was that it's perhaps possible that the spirit of, let's say, James, the original fighter pilot, that his spirit passed through somehow the spirit of James Leininger, and thereby gave him all this information. And that is not exactly a psychic explanation, like that the little boy had super psi, as you mentioned in the book. And it's not exactly that he was the direct born again. In other words, that he had access to the spiritual knowledge of James the pilot.
Well,
Right. No, I mean, I suppose that's a possibility too. It seems kind of bizarre as
Yes.
to why that would happen. But I mean, as far as little James was concerned, and this went on till he was about 4, he
Yes.
was absolutely convinced that he was that person.
Hmm.
And he had a lot of emotion around it. It wasn't just sort of these memories. It was actual reliving of things. And, so who knows? I mean, we can't say for sure, but
That's
I think
right.
Jim Tucker does believe that. And he actually wrote a chapter in my book about
Yes,
a lot
yes.
of different cases. And he certainly believes that this is the most rational explanation for it. But of course, we can't prove it.
Right.
But it starts and then it points down a path, and that's the path you start to follow
Yes.
in the book, and then you go from there into near-death experiences, and I think that has been shown a lot on TV. A lot of sort of these shows get into things like this, the ooh shows on television, and I find those really, really compelling
Yes.
because that is all within the same personality. Someone passes on for a brief period of time, describes what they saw and felt, and then comes back to tell us. And you give some very compelling stories about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reincarnation cases, raise the question of if conscious, is there some kind of continuation that goes on of consciousness? And what the interesting thing about the veridical out-of-body experiences and the near-death experiences are that they suggest or show really that consciousness can function independently of the brain.
Absolutely.
It doesn't
good.
show that that happens necessarily at death, but it certainly it makes that conceivable, because if consciousness can function separately from the brain, we can certainly hypothesize that could happen when we die. And there are some medical doctors, such as Sam Parnia, who's an expert in resuscitation science, who, as far as he's concerned, and I quote him, I mean, he's an absolute expert on dealing with people who have died and then are resuscitated, and he believes that these people that have these experiences are actually as dead as anybody who actually dies and doesn't come back, especially when you have cases in which the person is dead for, let's say, an hour or
Right.
two, which
Oh,
is,
my God,
yeah, it's
really?
more common now because
Oh.
they've learned that if somebody is frozen, or not frozen, but if they're in a very cool state, such as if they fall into an icy river or something like that, and their body is cooled down, they can actually be dead for a lot longer and still be resuscitated. And this is a fairly new discovery, because it used to be thought that you only had like 5 or 10 minutes,
Right.
and then you were brain dead forever. But these people, as far as he's concerned, they are a corpse for, say, 2 hours. They're then revived, and then within days they walk out of the hospital completely normal.
It's amazing, right?
So he doesn't really raise any difference, and he thinks we should call them actual death experiences, not near-death experiences. So, that really says something about some kind of functioning that is going on in people, even when they are essentially dead. And that's pretty intriguing.
Yes, it is. And Leslie, I would say that during this interview, I'm going to kind of be wearing 2 hats. One hat is kind of my hat as just an interviewer, and the other hat is my hat as a professional intuitive reader and a person who has had lots of psychic experiences. That is what I've done for a living for a large part of my life. So putting on the hat of the professional interviewer for a moment, I wanted to say that the veridical evidence that you present, I think, is possibly the most important part of the book from an outside point of view, like from the point of view of a person outside of the psychic interest group. Because that veridical evidence points very definitely towards the fact that I consider a fact, and or as close to a fact as anything, that consciousness is not necessarily, located in the brain alone, and that the brain is kind of a transducer of consciousness, right?
Right, like Pim van Lommel has proposed, and,
Yes.
and he's written a brilliant chapter in the book, I have
Yes,
to
he
say.
has. He has.
Really, really incredible about that very point, that, how he has discovered through decades of research into this as a medical doctor, that he doesn't believe that the brain is the generator of consciousness, as you say.
Well, the scientist, the German physicist, now deceased, Max Planck, said consciousness is fundamental. You can't get behind it. And
right.
And he was, the founder of quantum physics, basically, along with a few other guys.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's pretty compelling.
But what they're saying here is, though, that the brain is just flatlined for all practical purposes and is no longer functioning in any way that we would measure, and there's no parameters listed on a recording machine. But yet the person is aware of the surroundings and aware of looking back down on a body and then coming back. And so when they come back, where do they come back to? I guess then they start to use the brain to express consciousness. Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, they're just back in their bodies, so they sort of wake up and they're just like they were before. Okay. In terms of how they're functioning, but they have the memory of what just happened to them. And the interesting thing about when we talk about veridical out-of-body experiences, what that means is that the person actually experiences themselves in a position in some physical space in the room, and they're looking down on their bodies, as you mentioned, and they can report back afterwards real things that occurred in the room
or outside of it,
and that's why it's veridical, because it can be verified as real. And sometimes they're telling you things from a perspective of being up on the ceiling that they couldn't possibly have seen from lying down on a bed. I mean, certainly they're unconscious, of course, so that's enough. But one person reported seeing that the medic was bald, for instance. Lots of things that are from a different perspective, and they can report things that they've heard and tools that have been used while they were being operated on. And this is at a time when there are absolutely no brain activity or heartbeat. So, and they also, a lot of these experiences are very life transforming also. They're not just like some kind of a dream. The people experience them as being even more real than being in normal waking consciousness. And it's something they never forget. And it's something that takes away the fear of death for most people that have these experiences.
Well, but still, when they're in these states, they're still using the senses. They see. A lot of people will report odors. They'll report warmth, or at least so that there has to be some memory of senses.
No, the blind can see in these experiences sometimes. People who are blind from birth. So that would say.
But still, what I'm trying to say is that there is a sense. The five senses are also not just tied to organs, but also somehow or other to this. Being. Which
brings a point up that we, as human beings, only perceive less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum in which we live.
Well, okay.
All right.
It's very mysterious to try to imagine how you can see when you don't have eyes.
Right, exactly. That's what I guess
I think that's the point you're raising, and I think it is. It's a real quandary. I mean, if you don't have the physical organs that we're all used to, how do it's some kind of perception that one has in the non-physical state.
Right.
And it is very hard to conceive of. And I think that's a lot of reason that the scientific community has a hard time accepting it. It is hard to figure it out how it happens.
I think what it is maybe it's a memory of being able to, and possibly as that state continues, that memory starts to fade, and then there's a whole different set of senses that take over. I don't know. But,
I don't know.
Could be.
I don't know. But again, you sort of build your case. I think you would have been a very good lawyer, too. and you go from that to near death, and then you, as you say, the after-death experiences, too. But before you got into that, you really started to talk about mediums and how they could perceive people who had passed. And I think Fahrusha has a lot to say about that. I'm not very conversed with mediums and so on.
Just to start that off, I want to say that I thought that your choice of having Judy Beischel write a chapter was excellent. I think that she showed a great deal of sensitivity to the idea of what mediums do. Okay.
Yeah,
and
I think she's terrific. I agree.
I'm an associate member of the SSE, and I've met some of these people in person, and some of them, of the people in the book, have been on the show. So, basically, I am, just about 100% on your side, but I do have a big question. And you sort of flirt with this idea at the end of the book. And I'm not speaking specifically about physical mediumship. But the thing that I kept saying to myself while I was reading the book, because, as I say, I do work as an intuitive. I don't consider myself a medium, though I have gotten mediumistic information from people sometimes. And I haven't been tested like the people in your book, and I don't want to be. But because my readings are much more free-flowing. I sit with the person in person, so forth and so on. However, I'm also a person who has had a lot of psychic experiences, I had mentioned before in talking with you just now. So the big question I have is that it would seem to me that you sort of presented only two different options. It was like a binary hypothesis. Either it's human spirit communication or it's super psi, okay? And I'm not saying it's not, because I don't know. I'm the first person to say, I don't know. Many people, they do readings of various sorts, and they have controls, like the ones who are not physical mediums, the ones who are trance mediums, they have controls, and the physical mediums have controls, and so forth. And many readers who do this self-same thing that I do, they believe they have a spirit guide or something like that, and I'm not saying they don't. But what I'm saying is that there is at least a large third possibility, which I'm just going to outline for you very briefly here. And that is that what if it's a third thing? Nobody really knows where super psi comes from. People make remarks that it's like some pool of consciousness. And heck, it really may be that. But what about if it's a third thing, like a discarnate entity, which you flirt with at the end, but you don't ever say that some of this information that seems to be psychic or the person, the dead person, could really be a discarnate entity kind of masquerading as the person. And that's not as crazy as it seems when you think about what people have purported that aliens have done. Interdimensional beings, we could think about it as the trickster, the oversoul of plants, a whale spirit, the spirit of the earth. Could be angels, could be demons, could be jinn, could be ifrit. It could be a virtual reality game player or programmer, like Tom Campbell says. Many of these possibilities, as crazy as they posit a belief system. But what if it's a discarnate entity which we cannot identify? What if that? I felt like that could be a third possibility. What do you think, Leslie?
I guess you're right. I think what I was focusing on was what seemed to be the two most likely possibilities, and the ones that are sort of debated extensively among people who investigate these topics. It's sort of like the current debate revolves around the living agent psi hypothesis versus the survival hypothesis. And so that's what I focused on. I mean, because I think you may have a point there, but there's no way that, I don't know. It just seems like it's a little too obscure possibly for a book like this for me to get into that.
It might be.
And there's no way one could ever really know. And so I just find it more useful to just stick with the two major areas that seem to be the more likely.
And I think that they are the more likely possibilities to a large extent. The one place that, from my experience and from what you say in the book, in fact, is that to me, the stuff that seems to come from the actual spirit seems to come very shortly, within a certain period after death. In fact, when personal experiences have happened to me, people I know died, they came to me sometimes almost immediately, sometimes within 2 weeks afterwards, seldom months or years out. And then sometimes people have come to me who were clients, and they would say they're getting messages from somebody that they knew that was dead, and they would get message, and this would be true, and that would be true. And then suddenly they would get thrown a curveball, like telling them something that was only partially true. And so it would seem to me like if there is a part of it that could be a disincarnate entity speaking, it could be in that latter stage. And I'm going to let that go now. I have
no way of knowing. I think now you're talking about direct communications as opposed to through a medium, right? You're talking about after-death communications.
Yes, I am. And I'm also, yes, that's what I'm talking about. And through mediums, the medium is, I consider the medium an honest broker. The mediums that you saw, absolutely honest brokers. So I, as I say, totally discard the idea, especially in terms of the mental mediums, of any kind of hoaxing in terms of the mental mediums. Absolutely no chance, with the way Julie does her stuff, that there is any chance of hoaxing there. However, as you say, you don't know, and I don't know either, and I'm the first one to say I don't know. I don't know where the information comes from. And so I just throw that out as a third possibility for all things that we are speaking of. Except
okay, well, thank you for that.
Okay, well, move on then. I'm so sorry.
Okay, you know what I was interested in, Leslie, is like the mediums that you contacted seem to have a real gift for contact. And I was wondering, did anyone ever do, and I hate to use the word scientific, but sort of like an EEG study, just to see if there were any brain waves or anything that they were contacted on? Well,
that's a really interesting thing that needs to be done more of. And as I write in the book, the one of the mediums I saw, whose name was Laura Lynn Jackson, who's an absolutely superb medium who has since written an excellent book. There was a scientist, a brainwave scientist, I forget what you'd call him specifically, who did study her brain. And what was really interesting about it was that this was exploring the question of the two possibilities of the information being either her own personal psi or coming from a deceased person. So we're looking at those two possibilities, and he had her do both psychic readings and mediumistic readings, and then he tested her brain waves during the two different readings, and was able to determine that they took place in two different parts of her brain, which is very interesting because they corresponded to Laura's own description of the screen that she sees in front of her when she's doing these readings. And she has often said that the psychic information, or the information coming from her own psychic abilities, is on one side of her screen, and the mediumistic information, or information coming from the deceased beings, is on the other side of her screen. And she's very clear about the difference between the two of them. And his brain charts of her brain actually corresponded to exactly the way Laura had described it in terms of the sides of her brain that these events took place. So this is really important because it shows that there is a difference between her psychic information that does not involve deceased people, and information that does involve deceased people, at least in the way the mediums describe it. That they're two different types of information, and I think Laura Jackson is really fundamental, really excellent at being able to make that distinction. And that was a question I was very interested in during my explorations of mental mediumship, is how the mediums distinguish between the two. Because if we want to make the case that there is information that's coming from deceased beings, which is what the mediums perceive it to be, then you'd want to know that they can distinguish between the two types. And Laura was very good at that. And then the brain waves, the brain charts that this scientist made of her, only just reinforced and showed that what she was talking about was actually true. It doesn't prove that she's speaking with dead people.
Right.
But it shows that they are definitely two distinct types of information that's coming through to her, and that's what's really important.
I was wondering if they ran a control at the same time, because as these spirits were coming, or whatever you call it, were coming through to her, I'm sure they also, emitted some form of transmission. And she is obviously an excellent receiver for this. I was wondering if there was some other way to detect it in the room, but probably not.
Yeah, I don't know. I just wish they could.
Not.
I wish they could do it with more. It's expensive, and it's not an easy thing to do. And I know Julie Beischel is interested in trying to do more of this kind of thing herself. It just takes a certain amount of planning and financing and all of that. But I think it's an area that's really would be really excellent to pursue and could teach us a lot.
I think
about what's going on.
Yes.
Well, I'm pretty sure because when you think what your cell phone can pick up with a pretty, I would just say, primitive receptor, and all that information is out there, if you could get a human brain to start accessing that information, not necessarily from people who have passed on, but in general, it would be sort of fascinating to know.
And I think that's what the mediums do. They have like this antenna that's able to perceive information that a lot of us are not able to perceive. So it's very fascinating. And I was just really I was very careful to make sure that the mediums I visited had no idea who I was, and they were phoning. They were pretty carefully controlled as far as I was concerned. And I was really stunned with the accuracy of the information that came through. That was a real mind-opening experience for me.
You did an excellent job in, having it be a blind experiment, several of these readings. It was a very excellent job you did of that.
I always find
I made sure to take out a fake name and all of that, fake address, fake email address and everything else. So
it's just so annoying that when you deal with anything in the paranormal, you have to be so uber cautious, whereas in general science, 97% of our subjects were this, the other 3%, well, we don't really know. It's annoying to me. Don't you find it? Like you have to be so extraordinarily careful when you deal with the paranormal. I mean,
Right. It's true, because it is so hard to accept.
Yeah.
So you've got to be extra careful. And, I respect that. I'm happy to be as careful as I can.
You were.
But, I tried to be in the book.
Well, the evidence for paranormal functioning, psi functioning, if you will, is much greater, shows a lot more mathematical certainty than the idea that taking a baby aspirin will prevent you from having a heart attack. And look at all the people all around the world who are taking baby aspirins to prevent heart attacks, who don't believe in psi functioning.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I think if you read this book, and, there's other places people can look as well, but the big question is not whether psi functioning is real. I mean, it is absolutely undisputable that some kind of psychic functioning is occurring in the cases that I've presented. The question is whether the origin of them is from a deceased person or from human beings. But you can't deny that the abilities of these people to perceive things that beyond the five senses is absolutely genuine. And even that is something that many scientists have a hard time acknowledging is valid, but it's just beyond my comprehension how they can look at some of these cases and deny that. But they do.
Well, there are, of course, skeptics, and then there are debunkers, and as we know, they're not the same thing.
We know that. I know that from the UFO topic too, and it's very similar with this as well.
Yeah.
I have one weird question to ask you, just out of curiosity. You said that you met Stuart Alexander, the physical medium. You said that you met him because he was giving a talk at a UFO presentation. So just out of curiosity, what was his connection to UFOs in addition to being a physical medium? I was fascinated by that little tidbit.
Well, actually, that wasn't the case. He was giving a seminar which involves mediumship, basically, which he does semi-annually. I mean, other people organize it, and he just invited me to give a talk there on UFOs because he thought his participants would be interested in the topic. That was all. But the focus was not on UFOs.
Okay. I misread that then.
Yeah, no, that's okay. And he does these seminars twice a year, and there's usually a group of people that come pretty regularly. But they're becoming more and more popular, more and more kind of known now. So that was how it all happened. And I then ended up spending a lot of time with him and have since gotten to know him very well.
Sounds very, very fascinating. Also fascinating is the Canadian experiment where they created this. Actually, it would seem to me that they created a tulpa. One of those beings that once created continues to have an existence outside of the person. Aleister Crowley created a tulpa. I think some British woman who traveled to India created a tulpa that other people could see. But it would seem like this group in Canada created this being that then had a life of its own on some level.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like being a mini god. These people were like mini gods in a sense.
Yeah, well, I think you're talking about the Philip experiments in the 1970s.
Up in Canada, you mentioned it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And where this group, as you said, they focused for many months, probably at least 6 months, on sort of creating this life of this person in their minds, all the details of the person's life, who they called Philip, and he had died in, England some centuries earlier. And yeah, what was important was that then they were working with a table and they were getting this entity to respond to their questions through table tilting and knocks and things. And the entity could not answer any question that they had not previously provided the information for. So basically, this was like a self-created kind of poltergeist entity. And what it illustrates is that human beings do have the capacity to have these kinds of psychokinetic events occur without tapping into any kind of dead person. So a lot of people who will do table tilting, might, or things like Ouija boards and things like that, where there's a lot of psychokinesis going on, might assume that can't happen without some kind of spirit being involved. But actually, these experiments have shown that that's not always the case, that human beings can be facilitators for these kinds of events without any kind of spirit being involved. This was like a self-created entity so that was a really interesting point. I think it's important to note that, human beings can also facilitate all kinds of psychic events that can occur. And poltergeist is sort of an example of that. And this is a more sort of advanced poltergeist scenario because they were able to actually create it themselves intentionally. So yeah, it's really, that's why I wanted to that was my chapter that sort of brings us gradually towards being able to accept the kind of psychokinetic events that occur in the seance room. And as you mentioned, I've been very careful how I've structured the book so that I take a person from the sort of simpler, more easily acceptable things initially and then walk them through various stages of things. And one thing leads to another very naturally. And so by the end is when you get to the, as you mentioned earlier, the more you could use the word exotic. I like that word. Exotic things that are harder to accept, but that are just as real as anything that I have described earlier in the book. So,
well, you talk about your personal experiments, and the first one sort of was I could sort of get, but the second one with the hand materializing, you might want to discuss that for the sake of our audience. But that one. That was a little difficult for me to accept.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I can understand that.
But
I can understand it.
It was very real for you, my goodness.
Well, it happened.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no doubt that it happened, and it's been observed by many other people besides myself. So when you actually have that experience and you're touching it and you're watching it form, it's mind-blowing. And I can understand why, for anyone who hasn't had the experience, it would be difficult to accept. But I'm trying to sort of, in the book, show how other instances of hands being materialized have been documented in very, very tightly controlled conditions by expert scientists. And we have many cases of that having occurred. So I'm hoping that having read that first, that it might make it easier for the reader to accept it when I've actually experienced it myself. But everybody's going to react differently to that.
What do you think of the idea of consensual reality? In other words, many people who are more philosophers than psychic readers or parapsychologists are of the opinion that we all create our own consensual reality, that reality may not come just from you, Leslie Kean, or just from me, Fahrusha, but is like we all accept that certain things are true so that they are true. And we have created the world in some way like little tiny pieces of God, that we could all sort of create the world. And therefore, why not a physical hand?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that. Again, it's philosophy, and it's in my book is so focused on journalism, of just trying to present information and
I just
factual
throw it out
information.
there.
Yeah, it's absolutely right on and fascinating. It's just something sort of beyond my capability to address. I hate to tell you, you're both absolutely wonderful, and I could talk to you for a long time, but I have to be going now, unfortunately.
Okay. Well,
always leave them wanting more, Leslie.
Oh, I know. Well, I could go on. You guys are just wonderful to speak with, and I so much like talking to you. I wish I didn't have this other appointment lined up here.
Just say the name of your book and the publisher, et cetera, because otherwise, we won't get any sales for you.
Great. Absolutely. The book is called Surviving Death: A Journalist Investigates Evidence for an Afterlife. And my last name is spelled Kean. And you can go to my website, which is Surviving Death Kean, my last name attached, .com. And on that website, you can find information about the book and my UFO book. And I'm also very active on Facebook and would love people to visit me there. And I thank you both so much for talking with me about this book. It's meant a lot to me.
Well,
thank you,
and
being on.
Best of luck with everything.
Really.
Thank you again. Take care, Leslie. Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, so what do you think?
Well, I think it's a really wonderful book. I was really thrilled to read it.
Yeah,
and I do understand her reasons for structuring it as she did, and I just wonder about that third idea.
Well, I guess it's not to beat a dead horse to death, but we are all dying to find out.
Okay, I'm not. I'm just as long as stay around for a while.
I find it very interesting in a lot of different ways. For example, I think what we call instincts in animal is actually they have a receptor in their brain for information that is necessary for their survival.
Sure.
Birds know how to build nests, I don't know, many things. But someone had to create that information. Someone, somewhere, somehow, even
something.
And so I think there's just tons and tons of information out there, and you have to wonder, where it all came from.
Absolutely.
I don't think we'll ever know.
Well, you might know, but you might not be able to tell me right off.
Yeah.
Or vice.
Yeah.
Excuse me, vice versa.
Sure. Well, anyway, I'm sorry. You had some other information for us.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, people.
That's okay. It had concerning our next guest, which will be
Dr. Milton Wainwright.
Right. And
he's a proponent of panspermia. He's a British professor.
I always wonder why they call it panspermia, not pan
I'm
over.
sorry, I'm going to take a drink of
go
water.
right ahead. Anyway,
say nice things.
I will say very nice things. So I think you should really tune in for that particular one. Panspermia is basically the idea that life permeates the universe and is spread throughout.
Life is ubiquitous throughout the universe.
See,
even if it's in small doses, like little cells, little one-celled organisms, little spores and the like.
Well,
lichen.
Every life form on this planet has DNA at its basis, and my little theory on that is that DNA is a molecule that captures energy and then transforms it into a life form suitable to the environment in which it finds itself. And I think it has that much plasticity in its ability to do that. So that I think DNA is ubiquitous, as you say, and I think we're going to find, if we could look ahead 1,000 years, some really interesting and weird life forms out. I mean, if you go back on this planet 200 million years ago, it would look like a whole alien planet.
Absolutely.
So, but anyway, so that will be a very interesting discussion because he's also, here you go, Fahrusha, ready? Another famous person that studies that is Chandra
Wickramasinghe.
She loves to say that.
And not only that, but Dr. Milton Wainwright knows
Chandra
Wickramasinghe.
Okay, that's terrific. It's good he has a good sense of humor, too. But much more importantly, we have an upcoming event where you can join us at Pine Bush,
the
New
Pine
York.
Bush UFO Festival on May 20th, 2017.
It's a lot of fun.
We will be there. Now, most of the day is fun family stuff.
Yeah, you can bring costumes and all. People won't think you're weird. And actually, they have a UFO patrol car, and a lot of people dressed up as aliens. And
children, wear your UFO costumes.
Sure.
Adults,
they do
wear your UFO costumes.
And they have good food, too.
Yeah, they have
Really
the local restaurants are serving, and the Cup and Saucer Cafe, which the saucer is a flying saucer. And there are other kinds of foods being served out of food trucks. In addition, we may be participating in, besides having a table there, we are expecting that we will be interviewing people who are experiencers and some of the speakers. There is some small possibility that I will be speaking on a group of theories surrounding possible alien evolution. And these are theories, but there is a decent possibility. I'll be speaking about that in the afternoon at the afternoon group. And so please come on out May 20th and tune in prior to that for Dr. Milton Wainwright, proponent of panspermia. And he does some inexpensive experiments with weather balloons where he sends up something akin to a cassette player that is wrapped up so it's hermetically sealed, and it opens when it gets above the stratosphere. When it gets into the edge of space, these dishes open up and they collect samples of one-celled organisms and things that are living up there that shouldn't be living up there. And he then closes the tray, it reseals itself, and he brings the weather balloon down. And so he's going to share those experiments with us, which I think, what could be more fascinating than that?
Offhand, nothing too much.
Nothing too much, no. So, once again, for Shattered Reality.
Okay, it's Kate Valentine.
And Fahrusha.
And we'll see you next time.
Goodbye from Shattered Reality.
What was that?